Welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out our website and also perhaps come to our conference next year in Dubai. In this session, we welcome Dr. Jessica Shiller for a presentation titled Out of Crisis Comes Resilience: Community Schools' Potential to Generate Social Capital. Jess is a professor of education at Towson University in Maryland and director of the Maryland Center for Community Schools. She is the author of many publications, including Preparing for Democracy: How Community-Based Organizations Build Civil Engagement among Urban Youth, and Transformative Capacity of Baltimore's Community Schools: Limits and Possibilities in a Spatially Unjust Urban Context for Black Communities. We're delighted you've agreed to give this webinar, Jess. Welcome, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'll say good afternoon, although it's morning or evening, depending on where you are in the globe. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. So I just want to give a little bit of background about who I am. Tristan, thank you for that introduction. I've been in the work of education for about 30 years now, which is hard to believe. Starting out actually as a community organizer, then a teacher in secondary schools. And shortly after that, I ended up as a director of a school and then onto a PhD program where I got a degree in education and have been in higher ed ever since. This work in community schools that I'm in now, and I'll talk about what community schools are during the talk, really brings together and braids a lot of my interests in public schools, in communities, in neighborhood change. I'm very interested in the ways in which schools can really contribute to bringing people together, driving up the quality of the experience that people have in communities, whether they're adults or kids or community members, neighbors, what have you. I believe in the transformational power of public education, especially in a country like the United States, where we need our public institutions very much to play that role, especially now in today's context. So with that, I'd like to share a little bit today about this recent work, which comes out of some research that I've done over the last couple of years in community schools. But I'll really start by talking about social capital, because that's why we're all here, right? Now, social capital, I think we all are interested in it because of its transformational power. But I'm going to argue today that it has sort of two sides, right? Social capital can either strangle or strengthen. It can be an amazing, powerful resource to build trust, to grow communities, networks, and provide for all kinds of needs for adults, kids, etc. On the other hand, we know that social capital networks are constrained by or defined by the network that one is in. So if one does not have access geographically or part of their network to power resources, that might mean that their social capital network is quite small. Or, as Stanton Salazar has argued, becomes a social prison. And that sounds very extreme kind of language. But when we think about communities that are experiencing extreme poverty, for instance, or racial isolation, in those kinds of communities, that can happen. right? So social capital is something that we need to um, sort of ignite in communities like that. Um, and that can happen in all kinds of ways, in ways that I'll argue today for. But just I want to make us aware that there is this tension, there is this um, kind of polar nature of social capital. It's great on the one hand when it's great, and on the other, it can be a challenge. I'm going to situate the remarks that I'm making today in the city that I live in the US, which is Baltimore. And I want to talk about why that city really embodies this sort of contradiction in social capital. There's two images that I'm sharing with you are two photographs of the city. One is a beautiful sky scape of downtown, which is right on the water, a place that we call the Inner Harbor. It's quite beautiful, day or night. And the other photo is a photograph in a neighborhood in Baltimore where you can see boarded up windows, a single person walking on the street. It does not look particularly vibrant, right? Why do I share this with you? I share this because Baltimore, like many other American cities, is characterized by what we call spatial inequality, falling along race and class lines. And so these two images that you see of Baltimore could be St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, many other American cities, which are filled with contradiction. The particularities of Baltimore are quite interesting because of its early adoption of some of these sort of constraining forces, and the ways in which, again and again, the people of the city have risen up and become really resilient in the face of those kinds of constraints. So like I mentioned, Baltimore was sort of an early adopter of some of the kinds of policies and constraints that made social capital acquisition particularly difficult. It was a city more than 100 years ago that was the first to make a plan for housing segregation in the United States, which is something many people actually don't realize. This happened around the turn of the 20th century. And because of those policies, actually, some of which predate our Jim Crow laws, which were our segregation laws, they were really kind of baked into the system in Baltimore. Baltimore to this day really is a city that is Black and white. There is certainly some mixing, or I should say more than some. But in terms of where people live, where they work and hang out, we really do retain a lot of that, the segregation of the early days. Um, that is important, right, for social capital because it sort of sets the stage. What I was saying earlier about how social capital can be at once transformational, but also constraining. And I would say both for both communities, right? If you have a segregated communities on both sides, whether they're white folks and Black folks, or whatever groups there are that are segregated by law, you are actually enforcing a particular kind of network on that community for which they cannot escape unless they are subversive in some way. This can be positive. right? I want to just add that in American history, segregated communities have also been some of the most resilient. This is really what has produced in Baltimore and other places like it, Black-owned businesses, Black-run institutions, and a lot of Black leadership. That's been quite amazing. And had segregation not happened, I don't know that those kinds of institutions and longstanding businesses would have resulted. However, that doesn't mean that we want to continue that kind of practice. But I say that to sort of set the stage of where this work is sort of coming up from. So some years later, by the 1930s, the housing segregation that I just discussed became codified through an agency called the Home Owners Loan Corporation, or what we know in the US as HOLC. And HOLC was born in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And at that time, obviously, the world was experiencing economic crises. And so one response to that was to help banks mitigate their loan making. And so they produced a series of maps. There's one for every major city in the United States, and this is the one for Baltimore. And these maps were colored red, yellow, and green to show which areas of that city were worth lending to, and which had highest risk. So the red zones were the worst to lend to, right? These were neighborhoods in which folks were low income, probably couldn't pay back the loan if you made it. The green were the best to loan to, with wealthy residents who could definitely pay back those loans. Why do we care about this? Well, it turns out that these maps really overlaid very well with the kinds of segregation that was already in effect. So that area that's red on the Baltimore map here was already an area that was segregated and mostly Black. And so having this policy put into place in the 1930s and did not actually get lifted until the late 1970s really ensured that certain people could live in certain neighborhoods and others, right, away from other folks. During this time, actually during that period of the 1930s through the 1970s, we also had the decimation of of a lot of public transportation infrastructure. We built interstate highway systems. And so traveling between neighborhoods became much more challenging unless you had a car. And so this contributed very, very much to the degree to which folks had networks and capital, whether it was economic capital, cultural capital, social capital, or any other kind. Living in one of these green areas, right, we had access actually to a lot of networks, employment, education, all kinds of different resources, whereas in what we now call redlined areas, and those are areas within these red marked zones, and these maps were confined to the kinds of places and spaces that they were living in, right? Which really limited the social capital network. So, as I said, Baltimore did not become like this city that we know overnight. It happened through many years of policy. So now on to today. Enough of history, right? Baltimore retains a lot of the kinds of segregation, though, that it had back in the day, as we say, but has played out somewhat differently. So what you'll see here actually in this map of population distribution, which is a little bit dated in terms of its numbers right now, but really has not changed dramatically. We have an area in the middle of the city that you see where the pink is kind of running down the very center and off to the right, making an L shape. That is mainly our white residents in the city of Baltimore living in those areas. That has now affectionately, locally been called the White L. In the blue areas to the left and right are the Black dominant neighborhoods that we now call the Black Butterfly. My colleague Lawrence Brown at Morgan State University has coined those two terms, and they have been so resonant with local people that is really how today people speak about Baltimore, or the two Baltimores, I should say. The durability of that kind of segregation from back in the day, from those early policy days to now, has not only affected where people live, but what people have access to, hence the connection to social capital. So just to share a little bit more of the geography, I should say, I used to be a high school social studies teacher, so integrating history and geography and other kind of like sociological data is super interesting to me, if you haven't guessed that already. Anyway, as you can see, here are other maps of the city of Baltimore. This on the left is just another representation of that white L black butterfly concept. And on the right, you can see how that sort of mirror into the income level of folks living in that area. So that's in a lot of ways why race and class are so conflated in the US. We have this policy history that we haven't quite disentangled ourselves from, but that has made it so our majority Black communities have often been, but not exclusively, but have often been low income. And again, that's tied to all kinds of other resources and connections. So, including investment. So investment is much lower in Black communities and white communities, which are also, right, high and low income, respectively. This also impacts access to other kinds of resources. So what you're seeing here is a map of a cutout of a couple of different neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore, which show the comparison of what it's like to live in these areas. So you can see in the bar graphs on the left, which sort of compare how folks are living in these neighborhoods that are also, quite close together, almost side by side. You'll see a radically different experience from a lack of food affordability and high rents to a limited access to internet and vehicle access. And by that I mean cars, which is very important in a city like Baltimore. Most American cities, actually, besides New York and Boston, need our car accessible only. Very, very poor public transportation systems in most of our big urban centers. So because of that, right, you can imagine how your social capital network might be constrained if you don't have access to the internet very well, or you can't travel, or you can't afford your rent to stay in that neighborhood, so you have to keep moving. So your connections that you may have made might be broken, having to move around multiple times. Again, another access map around what it means to have no vehicle. that has just become a big issue here in the city. Actually, there's just a report that was produced a few months ago, talked about how difficult it is for kids to get to school because of their parents' lack of vehicles. The bus system is so poor that students are really struggling to get to school on time or at all. So it's really important that we think about, these are not things we think about normally when we think about social capital, but they are all tied together, right? We want to gather in places and get together in person, but if we can't get to them, it's very difficult to make that demand. And so you may see actually people physically coming together in very, very different ways in different kinds of neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where people need to walk to something, are just going to have a different kind of gathering space than one in which everyone can drive to a space. So what can we do about this? And short of ending all of the inequitable policies that we have and having massive, investments in infrastructure like housing, transportation, what can we do, right? With this issue about, social capital being constraining. Well, I would, in my work, I think leveraging public institutions is a great way to do that. One thing that we do have a lot of in the U.S. Is public schools. Public schools are major public institution that everybody has access to across the country, whether you're living in a city, out in an extremely rural area. That is the one place that's there for everyone. It's not even a faith-based institution because that may or may not be accessible or welcoming to everybody. Public schools are inclusive, and they are, like I said, they're located in every community. And so, as a matter of fact, in this last round of budget talks in the US, where there was a declaration of major cuts to public education, folks who are Republican and Democrat really pushed back on that because public institutions serve so many communities across the country, no matter what the politics or the geography. Now, where I am in Baltimore, which is in the state of Maryland, there have been a massive investment in public schools recently in the last few years, which has been a really great thing to see because it's provided for an incredible transformation to schools, which have leveraged them to advance more social capital in communities, no matter what the constraints are in them. So we had legislation that passed locally called the Blueprint, which made a $4 billion investment in public schools in the state. And that has been a historic investment. We've never put that much money toward education locally. And if you know anything about American education systems, we are not centralized across the country. Every state funds its own education system. There's a tiny bit of federal money that comes through from the US government, but it's very important for states to invest in their public schools because that's really where the lion's share of funding comes from. So we made this investment in 2021, and it has transformed the state's education system. We now have these things called community schools. So I talked about getting to that in my talk, and here I am coming to it. So what is a community school? Well, a community school is a school that really repositions the idea of what a public school is. Most people think about schools as a place where academic learning takes place. Kids go, they spend a lot of time there. They come home and they're prepared for university or some other pathway afterwards. A community school tries to think of itself as a community hub. So not just that, right? A community hub that is responsible for reaching out to families, for amassing community partnerships, and bringing together everyone in the surrounding area physically in person, and to also be very responsive to the needs of that community. So community schools engage in a process actually called an asset and needs assessment. They look around, they talk to people, they interview them, they walk around the community, they try to find out what's going on. What do people need? What do people like? What do they want to see? And what's available to them? And the school helps bring a lot of those things together in one space. So the place that most adults and kids go to every day in their community, the school, houses all of those things in one place, plus more. Plus, the community school also does a whole lot of other things. They have events, they have activities. They try to do all that they can to make sure that the community thrives. And that's great for all kinds of reasons. But in terms of social capital, right, it actually brings um, the community organizations, the government institutions, the faith-based institutions, the local businesses together so that adults and kids in that community can form those relationships, right? It reduces the barriers to creating those relationships and to building the network that might otherwise be there because of the limits of transportation or feeling intimidated for whatever reason, not having a connection to a local agency or an institution. The school helps broker those things. And so the community school is able to ignite those kinds of networks and partnerships. Um, this is just a quick distribution of these community schools across Baltimore. I guess I'll get back to that in a second, but just so you're aware, right? They're all throughout the city and they're all throughout the state as well. I really wanted to emphasize that community schools are now over 50% of as of this year, over 50% of the public schools in the state. And as I said, this framing of social capital really is a helpful one for understanding the role of the community school. Um, I'm just going to, invoke the the guru in social capital here, Robert Putnam, who I know is keynoting uh, the convening in 2026. But as you probably know, Robert Putnam talks about bonding and bridging social capital. And bridging, of course, connects people outside their community, which community schools really do quite well. And they also bring folks together in the same community. And so post-COVID, this has been very important to bring people together who normally would not connect or see each other. They would normally be spending time at home in front of a screen. The community school as this hub can now do that, which is really vital for neighborhood success. So the framework has applied, I think, very well to this. And I shared this idea actually at a conference in April at the American Educational Research Association. And I should say that that was very well received. It really made sense to people as a framework that aligned very well with the community schools. So I just want to talk a little bit about the community school coordinator. So there's somebody actually at every community school that helps bring all these partners together. And that's an incredibly important role in every community. We know that social capital is built by people who roll up their sleeves and say, "Hey, no, we're gonna bring those people together. We're gonna make this activity or event happen." In this case, it's a community school coordinator. These are employees of the community schools, and that funding is guaranteed by the state. And they spend their time doing outreach to families and communities. providing for needs. And what you can see in this photo actually is a space in a school that the community school coordinator has created to stock with clothing and toys and shoes and food and personal hygiene items, all the kinds of things that people may need in a school that might prevent them actually from coming out and gathering with others because they don't have, but now they can go to the school and get for free if they need. And the community school coordinator makes that all happen and identifies people who are in need, who might need that, and connects them. So this quote I love from my colleague Claudia Galindo says, there's no other place where children can access the enrichment programs, the services. So they provide it here at the community school. And the community school has been filling all the holes, the enrichment holes, the health holes, the social service holes, but also in so doing, connecting people throughout the process. It's another great photo of one of the community school coordinators that I've worked with. And I want to share the sort of, meat of this talk is really about from a study that I did a few years ago about the role of community schools and the coordinator in particular in how they serve their communities and build social capital through relationships post-pandemic. So I asked these two research questions. To what degree, in the absence of functioning services and institutions, was a community school coordinator able to step in and support families and students they served? And the second was, how did the service provision provide opportunity to build connections, relationships, and social capital to do more transformative work that scholars of community schools suggest they do? So I really wanted to sort of get a sense of, I knew that this was great work, but what was going on the ground to make it so? So I spent time interviewing 15 community school coordinators, asking them a bunch of questions to kind of get a sense of what they had been doing, what their work was like, and found amazing things. And I am going to just stop my screen share for a second so that I can actually share a couple of audio clips from interviews that I think you'll find compelling. I know I did, to really have a sense of what kind of work they were doing and how important it is and has been to building social capital networks. So bear with me for 1 second while I pull those up. So the first one is from a community school coordinator that talks about supplying food to her family, the parent community at her school, how it happened, what had to come together for that to happen. Food insecurity is obviously like something that a lot of people contend with. And then for the school to provide that to families has built an enormous amount of relational trust between the school and the community, and it's brought a lot of people together. So I'm going to share this brief clip with you.
I had a spreadsheet and we just started to add it. And then we had originally wanted to pass out all the food at the school, but then they shut down people being able to enter the school. And so it was like, okay, if families can't come into the school to pick up the food, how are we going to get this out? And so the easiest thing to do at that point was just for me to drive it around the neighborhood. So I just would get in my CRV, I'd lay down all the seats and I'd pick up all the food. And then I had like a map system set up and then get added. I did that for 3 months and the summer started. And when summer started, we put out a push like on our like social media pages and everything, just be like, if anyone needs food, please like let us know. And then I would reach out and be like, is it okay if I drop it off at your house? Okay, you're not going to be home during the day. Who can I drop it off with? A neighbor? Okay. So we kind of created like that system. And then we have a really strong partnership. There's a church that's actually in our school parking lot, which is really interesting. And the lady who runs that, her name is Miss Doris. She is just like a community hero. She's Puerto Rican and she's been in the neighborhood for like 20 years. So she was there way before it was Latino. She's like, I'm the first one. She was like, I'm the one who started the trend. She always joked. And she's just a gem. She's a grandparent of a kid who was at the school like 2 years ago. And so her and I just get along really, really well. And she has a key to the church. And so when they were like, hey, we can't hand out food at the school, we were like, oh, but the church is in the school parking lot. And it's a bilingual church. And you don't have to be, linked to the church to get the food, but it was a really nice way because she lives in the community and she can just walk there. So she was like, oh, if someone's off of work at 9:30 p.m., like they can text me and I'll walk up to the church and open up the church and like grab food for them. So we created like this sort of network and it just worked really, really well. And then we got reached out to by a couple of partners from like World Kitchen. It was Alma Cocina. The lady who worked there is from Argentina. And so she was like really interested in serving like a Latino population. So they had recommended our school and she was cooking meals for the whole like 500 meals every single week that she was like fresh cooking that went out and we would have them and they would be gone in like 2 hours. Like she was like, is 500 too many? It's like, no, like there's a need for it. Right. And Celestial Catering also picked up some of it and they were handing out like 250 to 300 meals a week as well in the community. In terms of like healthcare access, obviously.
Okay, I'm stopping that one there. But you can just hear in this person's comments how important it was to bring folks together and how unlikely it sort of had been had she not known or connected with this local resident who at a church just said, hey, I'd love to help out. I've got a key. I'm going to be on site. These are the kinds of things that can happen when there's somebody out there drawing those connections and building the network. So I'm going to share one more, and this one is about trying to supply a community with internet access. And I know this is sort of a little bit pandemic related, but important, and that we know how vital having that kind of access is to connecting people with information and networks. So have a listen to this one.
Yeah, so our partners really came on board and really helped us through getting the packets out, getting technology. So around April was when, after spring break, we realized that, okay, we're not coming back until after spring break at this point. So then the district was like, okay, we're going to do virtual learning. We don't know for how long. So then we're like, okay. So then we realized that we needed not only a lot more laptops, but people needed internet. So partners came forward and said, we're going to put this dish on your school, a mesh network on your school. People who have the dish will be able to get the internet. So they went out and they started doing that. And then something happened and it worked, but then it really didn't work. And the University of Maryland stepped up and said, we're going to provide, well, Comcast really stepped up in the middle of all this and said, we're going to offer the $10.99 or $9.99 internet essentials for all families in Baltimore City. They probably did it across the country, wherever there is Comcast. So then they did that. But that didn't really help parents who may have been arrears with their bill. So then University of Maryland stepped in and said, we're going to purchase Comcast codes. And even if you owe, a bill or something, you'll still be able to use this code to get free internet access for an entire year. So we got families signed up, not just our school, but schools in Southwest Baltimore. So that was incredible. So then they did that. And then we had to think of a way, like the first week of virtual school was like, okay, how is everybody doing? A lot of mental health check-ins. It was really, really important.
Okay, I'm going to pause that one there. But like you can hear in that one as well, the community school coordinator was leveraging networks to connect people with utilities, in this case, internet, leaning on a local university partnership, and making sure that people who didn't have the funds to support their own internet access could get it anyway. Again, wouldn't have happened without the community school and that coordinator making sure that she knew what the needs were on the ground and then connecting folks with the right resources and the right partnerships. And now to this day, right, in both cases, actually with both of these particular schools, those needs are being met in a more robust and ongoing way. There's a tremendous amount of connection and relationship that our families have with those schools. And now the school is a place where people can go for reliable help, to connect with other families, to ask questions, to feel like supported and connected, right? Which are elements, all elements of social capital that we care very much about. So I share those things to bring that sort of to life for you, so you can really understand what the work really is and how it can make these robust connections with social capital. So like I said, there's this work of the community schools in the pandemic, but even post-pandemic, has really built social capital networks for families living around them and connected to them. And so in this study, I really found that the community school coordinators, through the work of supplying the needs, making the connections, all the things that they did in terms of outreach, built a tremendous amount of trust in a system where folks did not have a lot of trust, frankly. That did end up improving the social capital networks for folks, keeping people tied together, keeping them in contact with each other, with other things, with other institutions, agencies, organizations. And there's the capacity for more. There's the capacity for building neighborhoods in ways that can grow much more, and making real transformational change, whether it's to advocate for more resources, to make sure that neighborhoods have continued access to all the things that they need, and that they can get to all the places that they need to get to, and grow those networks. And finally, sorry, I think there was somebody who was maybe coming off mute, but I just want to say that so much more can be done in terms of organizing and power building. And so I developed this, heuristic that really just sort of lays out the ways in which a community school can move along a continuum of trying to get engage a larger community in growing relationships and social capital. I've shared this a lot with folks locally, and it has seemed to resonate. I think that through this public institution transformation that we've had, and the other state in the country that is doing this at such large scales, California, that we're starting to see really positive effects, and that's showing up in other kinds of data. More kids are attending school. We had a real struggle with absenteeism that's starting to turn around. We're starting to see in surveys that students feel safer and happier and more connected in community schools than they do in traditional schools. So all to say that this is a really positive turn, especially in a context where there can be a lot of constraints. There have been historically a lot of policy constraints and laws, and this seems to be a way of reversing that. So I want to thank you all for listening. And I'll pass it to you, Tristan.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jess. Fascinating presentation. So much to get into there, and it's clearly such an important topic. So we'll have some question and discussion now. Feel free to either raise your hand within Zoom, which you'll find under the React button, or just simply post in the chat, and we can either read out the question on your behalf, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. So perhaps a good place to start, if I ask the first question, is I'm interested in how the state is talking about these issues. You know, what sort of terminology are they using? Are they using the term social capital, or are they using a different kind of term? Not just, I guess, within the state and the government setting, but also within the schools and other stakeholders that are involved.
They're not really using the term social capital. I'm using it a lot, and I'm trying to get my colleagues to use it as well because I think it's um, so much more robust, honestly, than the term that is being used, which is really partnership. Um, and that is important. That's like an element of social capital, but it's not all that it is. And so I'm trying to kind of insert myself into those conversations. That's the beauty of being a director of a center for community schools in the state, that I do have this perch to advocate for that, because I think we need to also understand the power here of community schools. I will say the only exception to that, and even there, they're not using the terminology, but I'm again introducing that. The governor's office is also parallel to this, is has an investment in some of our lowest income communities, in neighborhood development, and that also has this incredible potential for social capital network building. And so we're just, having some of those parallel conversations now as well. So I'm hoping that in the next, coming, year or so, that they'll start using this too, and tying it to the literature.
There's certainly a lot of value in using the term social capital because it provides that frame that goes beyond just a partnership, but actually implies the value that comes along with it as well. And so it sounds like the entire community schools idea and system is predicated on developing social capital. But at the moment, it sounds like in the policy arena, they're mostly talking about it as nice to haves rather than need to haves, perhaps, and not quite getting there in terms of really framing it as something that is so incredibly powerful in terms of the impacts that it has and the way that it creates outcomes for the community. And I guess that's the value of perhaps trying to introduce the concept of social capital, as it might help to reinforce what I suspect they probably already are intending for the schools to do, but perhaps don't have the language to be able to articulate exactly what that is. And perhaps social capital could help with that.
I agree. And this is something that I think more robust conversations need to be had about that. And it's relatively new for people in the field to be talking about. So I think that's great, though, a great turn.
So I suspect I already know the answer to this question, given that they're not using the term social capital, so they might not be quite thinking about it like this. But it seems like there's a lot of potential to evaluate the kinds of impacts that community schools are having, and particularly the role of the community school coordinators are having in generating social capital, but also then the impacts that that's having. You know, what is it actually doing for people's well-being, for their livelihoods? How is it actually generating impacts? And not just perhaps the intended impacts, but also all of the unintended impacts as well, because we often see increasing rates of entrepreneurship or innovation or creativity or reduced crime. Like, there's so many other potential outcomes that occur that aren't necessarily the core focus of the school. So the question then is, to what extent is that kind of evaluation already happening, or perhaps planning to happen?
Yeah. Funny you should ask. I'm engaged actually in a big grant project now to do some of that work, um, to evaluate what we're calling, community well-being, and to really start to understand the impact of the community schools on one, like stabilizing communities that might need So just around basic needs like food, housing, et cetera, healthcare, and then looking to see some of those other impacts, right? Are neighborhoods feeling safer? Do people connect more across race, class lines? Is that leading to organizations starting or businesses being created or other kinds of, arts and cultural gatherings and things like that? So we're starting to kind of map some of those things just now. We're actually in just at the beginning of our semester. So we have a little team of graduate students that's about to embark on some of that mapping as we speak. But I'm really excited about that because in my just in my site visits around the state have seen some really interesting examples of that, where folks have used the perch of the school to create, poetry events or talent shows or just these are small things, right? But that hadn't occurred. I went out to a rural community not that long ago, where the community school, was working in collaboration with a local arts organization to put on the very first school musical in many, many years, which brought together an incredible amount of people who had nothing to do with the school, but who had skills in carpentry and wanted to help build sets, people who had musical talent that nobody had known about and had an instrument that they dug out and came and helped, or knew how to sew costumes and things like that. And so that's just a tiny little example, but something unexpected, right? That this initiative by the school has brought all these people together in a way that, as they describe, is not going to be the last engagement at all. Now we have people who have made trusting relationships. They loved the experience of it was quite amazing. It brought together a huge number of people just to watch the performances, and everyone wants to do it again. So, here we are, right, with now probably an annual tradition that may not have existed in a pretty isolated rural community. So it was a wonderful thing to see.
So then are there mechanisms to feed back in that kind of evaluation and greater awareness of the outcomes it's producing back into the policy making arena?
Yeah, so that's actually part of this project, is to design some of that those indicators. To date, schools really have largely been measured through academic outcomes, right? Our English and math test scores and things like that, and people haven't really thought about the idea of a school impacting in the ways that I've just mentioned. So this idea of a community well-being measure is one way of doing that, so that we can share that data back with state legislators, for instance, our governor's office. And all of that is planned later this academic year, is to be able to share some of that out, so that folks can really start to see, like, there's way more to a school than any kind of academic indicator can show. And I think we started to see that in the pandemic, just because people were home and knew that, right, the things that happened at schools, regardless of how small, just the get-togethers, hanging out in the lunchroom and all that stuff. We knew that there was more to it, right? But what we're trying to do is actually put that and quantify it a little bit, so we can show across the, at least in our tiny state, for policymakers, that this is quite remarkable sort of impact and change that this is going to have on communities, that actually would take some of the heat off of legislators in a way around, that they get around investing in public infrastructure, because some of the ways in which people are coming together are doing that organically through the relationships via the school.
Yeah, precisely. And maybe that's exactly the value of the concept of social capital, is that, like, we all know that these really valuable outcomes occur within schools where people come together and work as a community. But still, so often policymakers are thinking just purely in terms of educational outcomes. And so, I mean, you probably don't know, and I don't know, but perhaps within that legislative arena, they were thinking, well, let's spend $4 billion here on education, and they were thinking purely and maybe only about the educational outcomes that would produce. But as we can see through the research that you're doing, and of course an understanding of social capital, that it's producing all of these other benefits as well. And they're not small benefits, but they're really significant benefits that can flow through to things, like you said, like crime and public health and so many other areas of life. And so the mechanisms that you're producing that then can allow for that feedback to go back into the legislative environment to then say, well, look, you're spending $4 billion on education, but in actual fact, here's a lot of other impact that you're having as well. It's not just $4 billion on education.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And to me, that's incredibly exciting. And I want to be thinking more and more about this, about education more expansively, as a route to well-being. And I think, just generally speaking, we have to start thinking about community well-being, and not just siloed focus on a single policy area. But it's holistic, right? Communities aren't just spaces of housing or transportation, right? They're all the things. We do all the things every day. And so we have to think about how we measure that and how we invest in that in a holistic way.
And to some extent, there's a question in the chat from Kate, so we'll get to that in just a minute. But I want to just continue with this for a bit, if we can. This idea that we often, many of our funding systems are set up around those very specific kinds of outcomes. So there's funding for education very specifically. But of course, as we've just been talking about, the way in which the community schools are producing all of these other kinds of incomes, or all these other kinds of outcomes, sorry. And yet our funding systems kind of are siloed to such an extent that it can be difficult to demonstrate the benefits. And like the education department probably is like, well, okay, it's producing all of these benefits that maybe relates to policing or relates to employment or these other areas that aren't necessarily their mandate. And so when social capital cuts across all of those different kinds of outcomes, it becomes challenging to try to see who funds it and in what kinds of ways, and how we can demonstrate the impact of that. And it seems to be a challenge that we're experiencing. I'm not sure this is a question in here at all, but what are your thoughts on how we address that?
Well, it's complicated, especially because of the way education funding happens. In the US in particular, which is connected to property taxes and things like that. We've completely siloed the funding stream. Though this particular initiative, though, might be a model for thinking about things more broadly, because it is a reinvestment of tax dollars into an initiative that tries to cut through those silos. So imagine if we thought about this, if we took that same $4 billion and had some organizing principles around community well-being, what would that look like, right? This is just something I think, I'm glad that folks advocated for this to happen through public institutions of schools, because it made sense, sort of geographically. But imagine what we could do if we had an additional investment that cut across those silos. Again, brought people together to discuss some organizing ideas. Said, this is how we might invest in this particular community across all of the things, all of the aspects of how people live. And then let's measure it. Let's see, do our lives get better when we have investment? I suspect, if we, look to other parts of the world, to Canada, to Europe, to, places that do invest in like a social safety networks and things like that, and infrastructure, those are the happiest places, right? Places on the planet that say, my life is good, the indices of happiness are high. So I imagine the same would be true. Why not do that, right? There are some constraints to doing that. In the US, we have a particular culture around individualism that sometimes rubs up against those kinds of initiatives because we think, oh, every individual should be responsible for themselves. Um, and there's something to that, but what happens is that we don't think of our communities as communities then, right? We think of them as collections of individuals. Um, and then what do we do, right? If we're all just responsible for ourselves, then we're really losing out on the potential of a network to support us all. And we also know that's not exactly true. That even in communities that are maybe most strident about, individualism, there's still ways that people help each other. They just don't talk about them, and they don't talk about them in that particular framing. Um, but there is the neighbor, the church, the tiny organized group that comes together to make sure that everybody has a turkey on Thanksgiving or gifts for their kids at Christmas, right? They do those things, and whatever you call it, it amounts to be something similar in the end.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I guess, like, even in the most individualistic societies, like you said, like, people are still accessing benefits from social relationships. They're still getting ahead and getting by because of the people they know. They might pretend like they're all self-reliant and they do things themselves. But I think just about all of us, when we really reflect on most of the really important things that we've done or the opportunities we've had or what we've achieved, they've almost always been done with other people collectively, not on our own. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. But I wanted to pick up as well on the point about, if we spent $4 billion, we're spending it currently on education effectively. But what if we were more purposeful about spending that on effectively building social capital, not just education? And by being purposeful about that, I'm sure the educational outcomes would not be worse. They would probably be better.
Right.
But we'd also much more purposefully have a whole range of other outcomes as well that are improved, rather than just spending the 4 billion on education, but effectively maybe using an economic term like externality. There's all these other, positive and negative externalities that are occurring, but it's kind of ad hoc. It's not purposeful, it's not deliberate. They're just coming about as a result of the activities that we're doing. And in the case of community schools, they're really fantastic activities, but it's still not as purposeful as it could be. So perhaps making that kind of policy shift, that instead of funding education specifically, we're actually funding social capital effectively in the development of education, and then we can have a much wider range of benefits. And I guess moving past what you're saying about, we tend to silo where we fund education and we fund, employment and health, and they're all separate. But maybe we need to think a bit more holistically.
Oh, 100%. I think we do. But I think that's a challenge, right? So if you said to a legislature, I'd like to fund social capital, right? What would that look like? What are the things? What are the elements? And what does that even mean? So I think we have to build our like a vocabulary and our framing around what that might look like with loads and loads of examples. And I love that this network is sharing so many of them, because now we're starting to get a library of examples from around the world of what that can look like. Because I think right now the average policymaker doesn't necessarily understand what that investment may look like. Although I really do believe that your instincts are correct in that if we made those investments, we'd see positive outcomes in all of the policy realms that we have, right? But it's like coming at it from a different perspective. And I actually did some research a couple of years ago in New Zealand, so closer your way, and looked at some of the ways in which the the indigenous folks were starting to thinking about well-being, and that was impacting the education sector, but also a lot of other sectors as well. And there were people starting to develop frameworks around what well-being looks like, and that well-being um, those well-being frameworks had elements of social capital. Didn't call it that, um, but the connections, the knowledge of self and the connections to others, and the need to have a positive network that supports not just you, but your family, the land, the community itself, and its institutions was definitely embedded in that. So I think we can learn from spaces like that, to see, how can we borrow that? How can we translate that for our own context? To develop frameworks that will lean into community well-being, knowing that a key part of that, maybe the key part of it, is social capital.
It's interesting you bring up the New Zealand point because they originally embraced the community capitals framework
Mm.
in their kind of well-being budget, or their way of thinking about well-being. So it did explicitly, initially at least, include social capital, but a couple of years ago they decided to move away from the capital ideology. But it's still they're still talking about exactly the same thing. So instead of social capital, they're talking about social cohesion. But there's still a very explicit, at least in terms of policy, awareness of the importance of social capital and social connection, not just, of course, within the education system, but broadly within society. It was actually developed by the Treasury in New Zealand, so it was intended to be applied across all of society as a way of thinking about well-being, which is really great to see. And hopefully other countries can take a similar kind of approach to thinking about well-being as being so much more comprehensive than just purely thinking about economic well-being.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we do have one comment or question in the chat. Social capital is more important in developing countries. Social capital can play an important role in intergenerational mobility by counteracting negative effects of socioeconomic inequality. So if you get any comments about that, it certainly seems to be very true.
Most definitely. I don't know that it's more important in developing countries than in others, but it certainly is extremely important. I mean, if we're looking at the Baltimore example, I mean, there are many parallels to that city and developing countries, because of the economic struggles of so many of the residents. Um, and that is constraining. But the key to that, right? The key to unlocking that is to build the social capital network. And that often involves other policy initiatives too. Like I mentioned, we need transportation. We need people to be able to get around and move and be with each other. But um, I would argue that, social capital is important everywhere. We just need it to we need to look a little bit different in different places. But I think it's really important, no matter what, for us to come together across all kinds of different, identity markers and lines, whatever, um, to keep us from being isolated from one another. And then I think in places where there is economic struggle, that has this added benefit, right, of connecting folks with possible employment, or a possible opportunity for more stable housing or things like that, which obviously is also incredibly critical. And it is how wealthy people operate. It's how we get jobs and we get housing and healthcare and all the things, is through our networks. So it's no surprise, right, that would work well for communities that are a bit more struggling economically. It's just that we the way we talk about it is like, well, they need to, get their act together, or they need to make sure that, um, or like in the US, like I mentioned with individualism, that we sort of said, that person just needs to get the right job or get the right, do the right thing. This is not a moral question, right? This is like a question of whether you have the relationships and the ability to leverage those relationships. But if you have no opportunity to create them, there's no way that'll happen. Like I was also, this is another good example of a rural school, actually, there was a natural disaster, where this school was, that caused a tremendous amount of flooding in the community, and the local university took everybody in. They could live there. They had classes there. They used the athletic facilities, all of it. They opened up to the community. Lo and behold, that university, the employees of the university, the faculty, the staff, connected so well with the residents and the families and the young people, that has produced all kinds of other connections. There are families now that have jobs at that university that would not have otherwise. There are young people who are wanting to attend university who would have thought about themselves as university going. And those the facilities themselves, the sort of physical plant, is the university is now undergoing a strategic planning around how to make sure that those facilities are more accessible and more useful beyond the students that attend during the academic year. So it's incredible what can happen when you get those networks going. We hope that it doesn't happen just through a crisis. That's like my worry, that this research that I did, right, came out of the crisis of COVID. We don't want these things to only happen in crisis. They need to actually we need to be proactive about that and make those investments in times of actual when things are stable, so that we can avoid those crises to begin with, or when they do happen, that we're ready to make sure that we have everybody on hand through those connections to support.
And again, perhaps that's the value of a concept like social capital, is it can really help us to understand where the benefits are coming from. And so perhaps it provides a bit more impetus to do it not just in times of crisis or disaster, but actually to do it all the time, because we recognize the benefits. And we're seeing lots of great comments in the chat. Kate, who had to leave, unfortunately, but she said that when children and the family feel belonging and safety in the community, those kids will benefit in so many ways. It's incredible. But what I'd actually like to do is, if we've got about 10 minutes left or thereabouts, is actually talk a little bit about limitations and challenges and barriers, and whether the research that you're doing has illuminated any of those kinds of issues, either for schools in general, or I was actually thinking more specifically about the community schools coordinators and what kinds of challenges they might come across.
Yeah, well, there's definitely the issue of burnout. They are the way in which the community schools are have been designed, is that a lot falls on those coordinators. Um, and unless the coordinator is particularly resourceful and builds a team of volunteers and other staff people together, a lot does fall on them, and um, it can be challenging. So we see turnover in that role sometimes because of that. There are also, cultural barriers, language barriers, things that have to be overcome, but that are challenging to overcome. There are plenty of community school coordinators that work in communities that are Spanish speaking and they don't speak Spanish. How do you overcome that? That's not to say that they haven't been incredibly creative. in both learning language and engaging with people who are bilingual and things like that. But these are challenges. And then, the the tremendous, sort of economic inequality and the context in which we live and work here in the US are a challenge. So even when there's a coordinator amassing great partnerships and coordinating all kinds of initiatives, the barriers can still remain. You know, their transportation system, I know I keep hammering that one, but it just really is an incredible challenge to folks. There's also, larger contextual challenges of our current political moment that I was mentioning before we actually started the webinar, that prevent families from wanting to show up in public at schools or in lots of public spaces. So there are many challenges to work through. Nothing's perfect, and I don't want to paint a picture that, these schools are sort of the answer. They certainly are not, and there is no silver bullet when it comes to social capital or anything else. But what we do want to see is sort of a positive turn. We want to see things making positive progress. And I do think we are seeing that, and that is showing up in the data. The challenge will be to sustain the funding that already exists, and then, to make sure that folks get enough support to do the work. Ultimately, it would be great to see, this role of coordinator sort of broadened, so more people can enter those kinds of positions and share the load and share the work, because it's not easy, and it's a job that just takes a tremendous amount of time and emotional labor that gets sort of overlooked sometimes. And that's not easy either. I think we have to make those things visible, um, and show people like how much work that takes, and then try to enlist as many people as possible in it. And I think that's where this partnership idea is very valuable, because we all need to share the work in order for social capital to help us all thrive. Um, if somebody's sitting back in their chair and having other people do that work, there's going to be limitations around how much can happen. So I think we all have to sort of ask ourselves, how much am I participating in an initiative near where I am that will improve the social capital connections of the people around me? Or am I sort of sitting back and saying, oh, I wish there was something, but I'm I don't know what it is, and maybe someone else will step in and do it. Now, we all have to play some kind of role to make sure that happens. So, and I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think you made a good point. It's great that these coordinator roles are funded, but it also sounds like they're perhaps a little bit isolated or working on their own, and they're feeling a lot of pressure just on an individual person. Whereas what you said is really that if they build their social capital and they build a network that is working together and they can collaborate, they can draw resources and they can make things happen, then they're no longer doing it on their own, and perhaps there's not as much risk of burnout and the kinds of challenges perhaps that they're experiencing now. But I imagine the current framing and way of thinking about the role isn't explicitly in terms of building social capital. So perhaps just, again, the value of the concept, perhaps thinking about it as exactly that, and therefore strengthening the capacity of those individual coordinators to be able to build the social capital for themselves. So build social capital in order to build social capital within the community. then there could be tools and resources and systems and approaches and understandings that could help to facilitate that, which would perhaps be another lens on what they're already doing. They're already doing all of those things, but simply being more aware of it would allow them to be more purposeful about doing it, and then getting the kind of support that would help them to do that as well. So perhaps another benefit of thinking about social capital in using that term and in that kind of way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And we're at our center trying to think about ways, frames that folks can use to make this work more transformative. And one way is by thinking about the social capital that is produced through the coordinator's role. And so using that language, using that vocabulary, so that it starts to become more common, but also as a framing to think about, as you said, building the network of the coordinators themselves so they can do the work of the larger connection building throughout their communities is really essential for this to be working sort of on all engines, right? So that we can have the full benefit of what this approach to schooling could look like. So I couldn't agree more.
So we should look to wrap up shortly, but perhaps I know you've been talking a lot about the outcomes and what the research is currently doing. If you could just give a brief summary of what you see as the kind of key outcomes from the research you're currently doing, and perhaps any future research opportunities that you see, or any remaining questions that you'd like to explore perhaps down the road as well.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of the research, we're seeing some tremendous things in the community schools. We're seeing that teachers are staying in their jobs, that we're seeing, more teacher retention. We're seeing students and families report more positive feelings of connection and engagement with their schools. We're seeing what we call chronic absenteeism, which is, you know, endemic in public schools these days. We're seeing that drop. We're seeing attendance improve. We're seeing real incredible progress on those measures and others, including disciplinary infractions decreasing. So like a safer school environment. Um, I, as I said earlier, would like to sort of expand that out to look at more community well-being measures, to see and to really uh, demonstrate through data collection how these community schools are impacting back in the neighborhoods. We're starting to see some of that more, mostly anecdotally, but now designing measures that will um, show the correlations. Are we seeing, safer neighborhoods? Are people coming out at night to more events and activities? Are they feeling a greater sense of efficacy and civic participation, for example? So would love to see some of those things. I'm collaborating with faculty across disciplines, and I actually think this is vital to the social capital work, to really try to do this research with people in public health and sociology and anthropology and political science, to really just start to understand um, how to think and approach an understanding of community impact from the community schools. So we're designing some studies now that we'll be implementing in this next year and coming years, um, ultimately to show what that impact looks like in school, out of school, in the larger communities and neighborhoods, um, so that we can kind of continue to make the case that this is a worthy investment, and that we might need more broadly. I think that this is something that will sort of slowly unfold over time. It will take time to kind of, show the impact and also translate that for a broad audience. But I do know just from the ground level, and this is again another thing that we want to start documenting, is that the experience that people have with their schools and communities, how that's changed over time since the experience with a community school, that has been so much more positive. This is an initiative actually among many that the government offers that has been widely positively received, and that you can't really say all the time with initiatives that are offered by your state or national government. So when you do see things like that, right, we want to know, okay, well, why is it so popular? What are people getting out of it, and what is so compelling? And what I hear again and again on the ground is that it's compelling because people feel this connection. They feel relationships and sense of belonging, and that they're known, that someone cares about them, that they have a connection to a person or a group of people that they didn't have before. There's recognition. Everybody wants that, right, in their lives. And so I want to start documenting that and showing that, because I think that that's not just persuasive for the investment in community schools, but to address some of our larger issues socially, with loneliness and disconnection, that we're struggling with across the globe.
Absolutely. What a wonderful way to finish on a positive note, talking about the really powerful impacts of the government policy in this particular case. So let's wrap it up there. On behalf of all the participants and the association, Jess, we really appreciate you taking the time to give this webinar. We've got a wonderful series of webinars coming up, so I encourage everyone to check out the details on our website. And of course, we've got our international conference coming up next year in Dubai. So also hope everyone can come, and look forward to next time. Thanks again, Jess.
Thank you. Take care.